I stared at the crumpled flyer in my hand, reading the text for the 5th time. The paper was plain white, with simple black text that seemed intentionally vague. Participants needed 2-hour psychological study, $1,000 compensation upon completion, no specialized knowledge required. Below was a phone number, nothing else. No company name, no university affiliation, no details about what the study actually entailed. Under normal circumstances, I would have tossed it in the trash without a second thought. But these weren't normal circumstances. My apartment rent was 2 weeks overdue. My refrigerator contained half a loaf of bread, some questionable cheese, and a carton of milk that was definitely past its prime. My latest freelance writing gig had fallen through, and my bank account showed a balance that made my stomach clench every time I checked it. $1,000 for 2 hours of my time. It seemed too good to be true. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number before I could second-guess myself. Mindscope Research. How may I assist you? The voice on the other end was female, polite, and oddly flat. I'm calling about the study, I said. The flyer offering $1,000? Excellent. I'll need to ask you a few preliminary questions to determine your eligibility. The questions were surprisingly basic: age, general health status, whether I was taking any medications. When she asked if I had any history of hallucinations or reality dissociation, I hesitated before answering no. You qualify for participation, Mr. Reed, she said, though I couldn't remember giving her my name. Please write down these coordinates. She rattled off a string of numbers that I hastily scribbled onto the back of the flyer. This location is in Oakwood Forest. Please arrive at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. The session will take precisely 2 hours. Do you have any questions? I had many, but only asked, what exactly will I be doing? The administrator will explain everything upon your arrival. She hung up before I could ask anything else. That night, I barely slept. The prospect of easy money warred with a nagging feeling that something wasn't right. But when my alarm blared at 7 a.m., I silenced both it and my doubts. I needed that money. My old Honda protested as I drove deeper into Oakwood Forest, following directions from my phone's GPS. The trees grew thicker, blocking out most of the morning sunlight. The road narrowed, then disappeared entirely, replaced by a dirt path barely wide enough for my car. You have reached your destination, my GPS announced, though all I could see were trees. I continued forward another 50 yards before the forest suddenly opened into a perfectly circular clearing. In the center stood a building that looked wildly out of place among the ancient oaks. It was a modern structure of glass and steel, bright in the morning sun. No signs, no logos, no indication of what happened inside. Just a single glass door at the front. I parked and approached cautiously. The door slid open silently as I neared, revealing a small, pristine lobby with white walls and floor. Behind a white desk sat a woman with blonde hair pulled back into a tight bun. She smiled as I entered, her lips stretching wide in a way that never quite reached her eyes. Marcus Reed, she said, not a question but a statement. Right on time. Her movements as she stood seemed rehearsed. She wore a crisp gray suit with not a wrinkle in sight. I'll need you to fill out these forms. She handed me a clipboard with several pages of small text. I skimmed through most of it, standard liability waivers and confidentiality agreements. One section caught my attention. The participant acknowledges that subjective experiences during the test may vary and are considered valid research data regardless of their correlation to objective reality. I looked at her with confusion. What does this mean exactly? Her smile didn't waver. Just a standard clause for psychological studies. The administrator can address any specific concerns. I hesitated, then signed. The money, I reminded myself. Follow me, please. She led me down a hallway that seemed longer than the building's exterior suggested possible. We stopped at an unmarked door, which she opened with a key card. The administrator will be with you shortly. The room beyond was perfectly square and entirely white. White walls, white floor, white ceiling, with harsh lighting that left no shadows. A small table with 2 chairs occupied the center. I sat in one and waited. Minutes later, the door opened. A man entered, tall and immaculately dressed in a black suit. His face was handsome in an unremarkable way, with features so symmetrical they looked fake. He moved with precise, calculated steps. "Good morning, Mr. Reed. I am the administrator." His voice was deep and clear. "Just Marcus is fine," I said, extending my hand. He looked at it momentarily before shaking it. His grip was firm but strangely cool. "I understand you have questions about our study," he said, taking the seat across from me. "Yeah, like what exactly am I doing here?" "We are exploring psychological boundaries," he replied. "The human mind's capacity to process unusual stimuli and integrate complex experiences." "That's still pretty vague." He smiled slightly. "The efficacy of our research requires participants to enter without preconceptions. I can assure you there will be no physical discomfort involved." I noticed he didn't promise no discomfort at all. "I'll need you to sign one final consent form," he said, sliding a single sheet across the table. I read it more carefully than the previous forms. Most seemed standard, but one clause stood out. "Participant acknowledges that perception is subjective and temporary alterations to perceived reality constitute no lasting harm." What does this mean about alterations to perceived reality? The administrator's expression remained neutral. "Merely a legal precaution. Some psychological exercises can cause brief disorientation, similar to optical illusions. Nothing more." I hesitated, pen hovering above the signature line. The thought of my empty bank account pushed my hand downward. He retrieved the signed form and placed a silver pen and notepad on the table. "Shall we begin?" The questions started innocuously enough. Basic biographical information, education, career history. Then they changed to more personal territory. "What is your earliest memory, Marcus?" Probably my 3rd birthday. My mom made a chocolate cake." "And your most recurrent dream?" I moved uncomfortably in my seat. "I sometimes dream I'm falling from a high place." "When you fall, do you ever land?" "No, I always wake up before hitting the ground." "Interesting," he made a note. "What is your greatest fear?" I wanted to say something trivial like spiders or heights, but what came out was being utterly alone, abandoned and forgotten. I blinked, surprised at my own honesty. The administrator nodded as if this was exactly what he expected. The questions continued, becoming increasingly personal. With each answer, I felt as though I was revealing layers of myself I usually kept hidden. Something about the administrator's steady stare made it impossible to lie. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, he set his notepad aside. "We'll move to the next portion now." From a slim briefcase, he removed a series of cards. "I'm going to show you some images. Please tell me what you see." The first card contained the well-known black ink blot of a Rorschach test. I'd seen these before in psychology classes. "Two people facing each other," I said. "Look closer," he instructed. I stared at the image again. They're not just facing each other. They're the same person, looking at their reflection, but the reflection is slightly different. Where had that come from? I hadn't seen that at all at first glance, but now it seemed obvious. Very good. The next card showed another ink blot, more abstract. "A doorway," I said immediately. "No, multiple doorways, all leading to different places, and something watching from behind each one." My heart rate increased slightly. I'd never been this imaginative with ink blots before. "What is watching?" the administrator asked. "I don't know. Something that's always been there, observing. Something that knows me." The room seemed to grow smaller as we continued. I struggled to breathe normally. With each card, my interpretations became more detailed, more personal, revealing thoughts and fears I'd never consciously acknowledged. The administrator showed no reaction to even my most disturbing interpretations. He simply nodded and made notes with his silver pen. After the final card, he sat back slightly. The tension between us was uncomfortable, as if the room had been imperceptibly tilting throughout our session and had now reached a critical angle. "We're ready to proceed to the next phase," the administrator said, breaking the silence. "Please close your eyes and count to 10. I hesitated, a chill running up my spine despite the room's comfortable temperature. Something felt wrong, but I couldn't pinpoint what. I had come this far, and the money waited on the other side. I closed my eyes. I opened my eyes and jerked backward in my chair. The room had completely changed. Gone were the pristine white walls, replaced by grimy surfaces covered in brownish stains and what looked like mold growing in the corners. The harsh fluorescent lights that had been almost painfully bright now flickered erratically, casting sickly yellow shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. "What the hell?" I whispered, my hands gripping the edges of my chair. The administrator sat across from me, exactly as before, not a single hair out of place, his black suit still absorbing light in that strange way. His expression remained neutral, unperturbed. "Is something wrong, Marcus?" he asked, his voice perfectly modulated as before. I gestured wildly around the room. The walls. Everything's different. What happened? He tilted his head slightly, looking at me with what appeared to be mild curiosity. "I don't understand your concern. We're simply continuing with the assessment." My mouth went dry. Either he couldn't see what I was seeing, or he was gaslighting me in some elaborate psychological experiment. Neither option was comforting. "Let's proceed with the next series of images," he said, producing another stack of cards. I swallowed hard, trying to focus on the cards instead of the walls that seemed to be closing in. The first card he placed before me was nothing like the neat ink blots from before. The image appeared to move and change, making what looked like a screaming face that dissolved into a mass of writhing limbs. "Just a pattern," I told myself. "It's just an ink blot." "Tell me what you see," the administrator prompted. "It's moving," I said, unable to hide the tremor in my voice. "The image is moving." "Interesting. Please describe the specifics." I forced myself to look again. A face, screaming. And then it changes into bodies, twisted bodies. The administrator nodded and made a note. His silver pen caught the flickering light, momentarily blinding me. "Very good," he said, placing another card on the table. This one appeared completely blank to me, just a white rectangle. "I don't see anything," I said, relieved. The administrator looked at the card, then at me. "You don't see the figure in the black suit standing behind you?" I felt suddenly cold. I whipped my head around, nearly falling off my chair. There was nothing there, just the grimy wall. When I turned back, the administrator was looking at me with that same clinical interest. "There's no one there," I said. "On the card, Marcus. The figure is on the card." I looked down again. The card remained blank. "I don't see anything." He made another note. "Let's try another." The next card showed what looked like a car accident scene, complete with twisted metal and what appeared to be blood. I blinked, and the image changed to show a different angle of the same scene. "This isn't an ink blot," I protested. "This is a photograph." "Please describe what you see," he repeated as if I hadn't spoken. "A car crash. It's graphic. Why are you showing me this?" The administrator wrote something down. "And does it remind you of any personal experience?" "No," I said firmly. "Are you certain? Nothing from your childhood, perhaps?" The question startled me. My parents had died in a car accident when I was 12. I'd never mentioned this to anyone at Mindscope. How could he know? I felt something wet on my arm and looked down to see a dark red droplet, then another. I looked up and saw what appeared to be blood seeping through the ceiling, creating a slowly expanding stain directly above me. "The ceiling is bleeding," I said, my voice barely audible as I pushed my chair back. The administrator didn't even glance up. Tell me about your earliest childhood fear, Marcus. I stood up, nearly knocking over my chair. I want to leave. Now. We haven't completed the session, he said calmly. I struggled to breathe properly. The walls seemed closer than before, the ceiling lower. Behind the administrator, I could have sworn I saw a shadow move independently of anything in the room. What's happening? I demanded. What did you do to me? Everything is proceeding normally, the administrator replied. His voice distorted for a moment. Please sit down. I backed toward what I thought was the door, but found only wall. The room's dimensions had changed, or I'd become disoriented. Let me out, my voice cracked with panic. We need to discuss your fear of abandonment further, the administrator said, standing up. He seemed taller now, his proportions subtly wrong. Your parents left you, didn't they? Everyone leaves eventually. My chest tightened painfully. I hadn't told him that either. Stop it, I gasped. 10, the administrator suddenly announced. What? 9, he continued, his voice deepening. 8. The countdown sent a spike of terror through me. I didn't know what would happen when he reached 0, but every instinct screamed that I didn't want to find out. 7, 6. The blood from the ceiling was dripping faster now. The walls seemed to move in and out. 5, 4. I could feel a presence directly behind me and hear breathing against my neck. 3, 2. Desperate and terrified beyond rational thought, I lunged forward and slammed my forehead against the edge of the table as hard as I could. Pain exploded through my skull. 1. Darkness rushed in from the edges of my vision, and the last thing I saw was the administrator's face, looking at me with that same detached interest as I collapsed to the floor. Pain pulsed behind my eyes as consciousness returned. The fluorescent lights above me were painfully bright, forcing me to blink rapidly as my vision cleared. My forehead throbbed where it had connected with the table's edge. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was or what had happened. When my vision finally focused, I found myself still seated in the same chair, in the same white room. But something was different. The walls were pristine and bright. No blood dripped from the ceiling. No mold grew in the corners. No shadows moved independently. The room was exactly as it had been when I first entered, clinically clean and blindingly white. The administrator sat across from me, his posture perfect, his black suit immaculate. He looked as though nothing unusual had occurred. The first hour is complete, Mr. Reed, he said, his voice as measured and neutral as ever. How are you feeling? I tried to speak, but my mouth was bone dry. I swallowed hard, wincing at the soreness in my throat. What happened? I finally managed. You experienced a strong psychological response to the testing materials, he replied matter-of-factly. This is not uncommon. I glanced around the room again, searching for any trace of the horrors I'd witnessed. There was nothing. But the walls were, and the ceiling was... I gestured weakly, unable to articulate the impossible things I'd seen. Perceived alterations to reality are a documented side effect of our cognitive assessment protocols, he said, as if reciting from a manual, as stated in your consent forms. I looked at the clock on the wall. Exactly 1 hour had passed since we began. That couldn't be right. The nightmarish experience had felt like an eternity. I don't understand, I said, pressing my palm against my throbbing forehead. The administrator stood with fluid precision and retrieved an envelope from his briefcase. Your compensation, as promised, he said, placing it on the table between us. Thank you for your participation today, Mr. Reed. We found your responses most illuminating. I stared at the envelope, afraid to touch it. The first hour has yielded valuable data, he continued. You are cordially invited to return for hour 2 at your convenience. The choice, of course, is entirely yours. My stomach lurched at the mention of hour 2. There's no way in hell, I started, but was interrupted by a wave of dizziness. Take your time leaving the facility. the administrator said, seemingly oblivious to my distress. "The effects typically subside within 24 hours." He moved toward the door with that same unnatural precision. "Wait," I called after him. "What did you do to me?" He paused at the doorway, turning to face me with that same neutral expression. "We merely observed, Mr. Reed. What you experienced was already within you." With that cryptic statement, he exited, leaving me alone in the white room. I sat there for several minutes, trying to gather enough strength to stand. When I finally did, my legs felt weak and unsteady. I grabbed the envelope and shoved it into my jacket pocket without looking inside. The hallway outside seemed to stretch and contract as I made my way toward the exit. The receptionist was gone, her desk empty. The entire building felt abandoned. I pushed through the front door and stumbled into the sunlight. The air outside hit my lungs like a shock, and the reality of what had happened, or what I thought had happened, crashed over me. My knees buckled, and I barely made it to the edge of the woods before collapsing. My stomach heaved, and I vomited repeatedly until there was nothing left but bile. Kneeling on the forest floor, I gasped for breath, tears streaming down my face from the physical exertion. After my stomach settled, I leaned against a tree and pulled out the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was cash, much more than I expected. I counted it twice to be sure, $2,000, double the promised amount. There was also a small note card with elegant typeface. "Hour 1 complete. Return for hour 2 at your discretion." I stuffed everything back into the envelope and pushed myself to my feet. The modern building stood silent behind me, gleaming in the afternoon sun as if nothing sinister had ever occurred within its walls. My car was where I'd left it, the only vehicle in the small clearing. I climbed in and drove away as fast as the dirt path would allow, watching the building shrink in my rearview mirror until the trees swallowed it completely. On the drive back to my apartment in Riverdale, every shadow on the road seemed to change and move. Each passing car felt like it might be following me. The sensation of being watched prickled at the back of my neck, making me check my mirrors obsessively. I cranked up the radio, hoping the noise would drown out my thoughts, but the voices of the DJs occasionally seemed to distort, almost sounding like the administrator's carefully modulated tones. By the time I reached my apartment building, my hands were shaking so badly I dropped my keys twice before managing to unlock the door. I rushed inside and secured every lock, then pulled all the blinds closed. In the bathroom, I splashed cold water on my face and finally looked at myself in the mirror. I looked terrible, pale, with dark circles under my bloodshot eyes. But there were no physical signs of trauma, no evidence of the mental torture I'd endured. Just a small purple bruise in the center of my forehead where I'd struck the table. I touched it gently, wincing at the tenderness. At least this was real, proof that something had happened. It was gas, I told my reflection, or some kind of hypnosis. Maybe they drugged me. The rational explanations felt hollow, but I clung to them desperately. The alternative, that what I experienced was real, or that my mind had broken so completely, was too frightening to contemplate. I fired up my laptop and searched for Mindscope research. The results were sparse. A generic website with stock photos of scientists in laboratories, vague descriptions of advancing human cognitive understanding, and a contact form that looked like it had never been used. No staff listings, no address, no history of published research. I tried different search terms: Mindscope psychological experiments, reality alteration research, hallucination studies compensation. Nothing useful came up. Hours passed as I fell down internet rabbit holes, looking for any information about the company or similar experiences. By the time I finally gave up, it was dark outside. The envelope sat on my kitchen table where I'd placed it, the cash inside still untouched. I couldn't bring myself to use the money, not yet. It felt tainted somehow, like accepting it would be acknowledging something I wasn't ready to face. Too wired to sleep, but too exhausted to continue researching, I collapsed onto my bed without changing clothes. Despite my exhaustion, sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by vivid nightmares. In one dream, the walls of my bedroom oozed the same brownish stains I'd seen in the testing room. In another, I heard the administrator counting backward from 10, his voice seeming to come from inside my own head. I woke, gasping for air, sometime around 3 a.m., certain I'd seen a tall figure standing in the corner of my bedroom. The room was empty, but the feeling of being observed lingered. "There's nobody there," I whispered to myself, voice cracking. "Get a grip, Marcus." I turned on every light in the apartment and sat on the couch until morning, jumping at every creak and settling noise from the building around me. When dawn finally broke, pale light filtering through my blinds, I felt hollowed out. My eyes burned from lack of sleep, and my mind felt foggy and disjointed. I shuffled to the kitchen for coffee and stopped short at the sight of the envelope. The money inside would solve my immediate financial problems, pay my overdue rent, fill my refrigerator, keep me afloat until I found more freelance work. And yet, I couldn't shake the administrator's words. "Return for hour 2 at your discretion." As if there was any world in which I would voluntarily go back to that place after what happened. I poured myself coffee with shaking hands and stared at the envelope from across the kitchen. $2,000, twice what they promised. Why? The bruise on my forehead throbbed as a new and terrifying thought emerged. What if the extra money wasn't a bonus? What if it was an incentive to return? The first 3 days after my experience at Mindscope, I didn't leave my apartment. I ordered delivery food, kept the blinds drawn, and jumped at every sound in the hallway. The bruise on my forehead faded from purple to a sickly yellow, the only physical evidence that anything had happened at all. The envelope with $2,000 remained on my kitchen table, untouched. Every time I looked at it, I remembered the administrator's voice. "Return for hour 2 at your discretion." I couldn't bring myself to spend the money, as if using it would somehow bind me to that place. By the 4th day, rationality began to reassert itself. I needed to pay rent. I needed to eat. I reluctantly took $800 from the envelope and paid my landlord, leaving no explanation for my sudden solvency. A week after the experiment, I woke up at dawn from another nightmare where the administrator counted backward from 10 in that perfectly modulated voice. The walls of my bedroom had appeared to ripple and breathe during the dream, just like in that white room. I sat up feeling scared and made a decision. I needed to go back to Oakwood Forest. Not to participate in hour 2. I wasn't that desperate or insane, but to confirm the building existed, to prove to myself I hadn't imagined everything. The morning was overcast as I drove my Honda along the same route I'd taken a week earlier. The GPS on my phone guided me down the increasingly narrow roads until trees crowded in on both sides. My knuckles went white on the steering wheel as I approached the coordinates. "You have reached your destination," my phone announced. I slowed to a stop and looked around. Trees. Nothing but trees. No clearing. No glass and steel building. No sign that anything had ever disturbed the natural growth of the forest. "That's impossible," I whispered. I got out of the car and walked in circles around the area, pushing through underbrush, looking for any sign of recent construction or demolition. Nothing, not even a dirt path, let alone foundations or debris. I pulled out my phone and checked the GPS history, scrolling back to last week. There it was, the same coordinates, recorded a week ago. I had been here. The building had existed. Hadn't it? "Come on, Marcus," I muttered to myself. "You're not crazy." I took photos of the area from multiple angles, as if documenting the emptiness would somehow make sense of this impossibility. The entire drive home, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. Back at my apartment, I paced for an hour before sitting down at my laptop. I needed information, needed to know if anyone else had experienced what I had. I started with obvious searches. Mindscope research, psychological experiment hallucinations. Research facility disappears. The results were useless. Academic papers on hallucination studies, conspiracy theories about government experiments, fiction stories about mysterious facilities. Nothing that matched my experience. I dug deeper, searching forums and message boards about strange experiences and unexplained phenomena. Most were filled with obvious fiction or the ramblings of people with genuine mental illness. I was about to give up when I found a link to a forum called Reality Shift. The description read, "For those who've seen behind the veil, no judgment, no skepticism, truth only." The forum was small, with only a few dozen active users. I created an account and began reading through the threads. Most were vague, people describing strange occurrences or moments when reality seemed to glitch. But one thread caught my attention: the 2-hour test. The original post was from a user called Shiftwalker. Has anyone else been recruited for a psychological study that offered $1,000 for 2 hours? The White Room? The man in the black suit? The things you see in hour 1 that can't be real? If you know what I'm talking about, please contact me. I need to know I'm not alone. I felt deeply unsettled as I scrolled through the responses. There were only 8, but each described elements of my experience. The ink blot cards that seemed to move, the walls that transformed, the sense that the administrator knew things he couldn't possibly know. One comment in particular stood out. Quantum Observer. The 2 hours aren't consecutive. They're not even testing psychology. They're testing your ability to perceive multiple realities simultaneously. Hour 1 loosens your mind's grip on a single reality. Hour 2 is something else entirely. The administrators aren't human researchers. They're entities that exist between realities, studying our fear responses because they don't understand human emotion. Another user had replied, "Reality Runner." I went back for hour 2 3 weeks ago. I'll post a full account tomorrow after I've processed what happened. But there was no follow-up post. In fact, Reality Runner had never posted again. This pattern repeated with several users. They'd describe completing hour 1, mention plans to return for hour 2, then disappear from the forum entirely. Those who claimed to have refused hour 2 reported increasingly severe reality slippages, describing exactly what I'd been experiencing: walls that momentarily transformed to their nightmarish versions, shadows moving independently, voices that couldn't be there. I created a private message to Shiftwalker, describing my experience in detail and asking if we could talk. To my surprise, I received a response within minutes. "Not over the internet. They might be monitoring. Harbor Cafe tomorrow, 2 p.m. Ask for Sarah. Come alone and don't bring any electronics." I stared at the message for a long time. Meeting a stranger based on an internet forum post about shared hallucinations seemed unwise at best. But the alternative, continuing to question my sanity without answers, seemed worse. The following day, I left my phone in my apartment and walked the 6 blocks to Harbor Cafe, a small coffee shop overlooking the river. It was nearly empty on a weekday afternoon. I approached the counter and asked the barista if Sarah was here. "Corner booth," she said, nodding toward a woman sitting alone, her back to the wall, facing the door. Sarah didn't match any mental image I'd formed. She was in her early 30s, with dark circles under her eyes, and unwashed brown hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. Her clothes looked slept in, and her hands trembled as she raised a coffee cup to her lips. Her eyes scanned the room constantly, looking at windows, doors, other patrons. "Sarah?" I asked, approaching her table. Her eyes snapped to mine, assessing me quickly. "Sit down," she said, her voice hoarse, "and don't use my forum name out loud." I slid into the booth across from her. Up close, she looked worse, gaunt, with a grayish tinge to her skin that spoke of too many sleepless nights. "Did you check for tracking devices?" she asked immediately. "What?" "No, They could have tagged you during hour 1. They do that sometimes." She reached across the table and ran her fingers along the collar of my jacket, then checked behind my ears with cold fingers. "I don't think I've been tagged," I said, pulling back slightly. "You can't be sure." She sat back, apparently satisfied with her inspection. "When did you do hour 1? "A week ago." She nodded. "You're still in the early stages then. The slippages will get worse." "Slippages?" "Between realities. The bleeding through." She took a sip of coffee. "It starts small. Things you see from the corner of your eye. Walls that change for a split second. Voices that seem to come from nowhere. Then it progresses. Full visual and auditory hallucinations. Objects that move on their own. People with black eyes watching you from crowds." My stomach tightened. I've been seeing things. Hearing the administrator's voice. That's how it starts. Sarah's eyes moved to the door as it opened, tracking a young couple who entered. "I did hour 1 3 months ago. Now I see the other reality all the time, overlaid on this one. Sometimes I can't tell which is real." "What is the other reality?" I asked, leaning forward. "Not what. Realities. Plural. Infinite variations, all existing simultaneously, separated by barriers we're not supposed to perceive." She lowered her voice. "The administrators exist in the spaces between. They can see all realities at once, move between them. Hour 1 is a test to find people who can potentially do the same." I thought of the forum post that had suggested something similar. "So this is what... recruitment?" She nodded. "For some. For others, it's just experimentation. They want to understand how humans process reality shifts." "Why me? Why any of us?" "You were marked," she said simply. "Long before you ever saw that flyer. They've been watching you for years, probably your entire life. People who can potentially perceive multiple realities give off signals, I guess. Neurological markers. The flyer was designed to draw you in specifically." I remembered how I'd been inexplicably drawn to that plain white flyer, how I'd kept it instead of throwing it away. "How do you know all this?" I asked. She laughed, a brittle sound with no humor in it. "I've been researching since my experience. Found others like us. And I've learned to see them sometimes. The administrators, moving through the world, observing." As she spoke, I noticed something disturbing. Her eyes seemed to flicker, the irises momentarily turning solid black before returning to normal. She didn't seem aware it was happening. "Sarah, your eyes... they do that now," she said matter-of-factly. "Side effect of the slippage. I can see them more clearly, but it means they can see me too." I glanced around the cafe nervously. "Are they watching us now?" "They're always watching once you've participated. You're interesting to them now." She leaned forward suddenly, gripping my wrist with surprising strength. "But there's someone who might be able to help. He used to work with them before he realized what they were doing to people like us." "Who?" She glanced around again, then slipped a folded piece of paper across the table. "Don't look at this until you're alone. And don't tell anyone where you got it. They're watching, but they can't watch all the time." I took the paper and put it in my pocket. "What about hour 2? All those people on the forum who went back. Why did they stop posting?" Sarah's expression darkened. "Either they became like the administrators or they couldn't handle what they saw and..." She trailed off, dragging her finger across her throat. "Hour 2 changes you permanently. The only question is how." Her eyes flickered to solid black again, longer this time, and she stiffened. "I need to go," she said suddenly, gathering her things. "They're getting closer." "Wait, I have more questions." "The slippages will get worse," she repeated, standing up. "Much worse. Soon you won't be able to trust anything you see or hear. Get help before that happens." Before I could respond, she was walking rapidly toward the door, head down, weaving between tables with the practiced movements of someone used to remaining unnoticed. I sat there for several minutes, trying to process everything she'd told me. Part of me wanted to dismiss her as delusional, but too much of what she described matched my own experiences. And those eyes turning completely black. That wasn't something someone could fake. I paid for her abandoned coffee and walked home slowly, hyper-aware of every person I passed. Did that man in the business suit pause too long when I walked by? Was the woman at the bus stop watching me specifically or just looking in my direction? By the time I reached my apartment building, the sun was setting. I climbed the stairs to my floor, key already in hand. At my door, I paused. Something felt wrong. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I inserted the key slowly and turned it. The lock clicked, and I pushed the door open cautiously. Nothing seemed immediately amiss. The lights were off, just as I'd left them. My laptop sat closed on the coffee table. But as I moved into the living room, subtle differences became apparent. The stack of mail I'd left on the kitchen counter was too neat, the envelopes too perfectly aligned. The couch cushions had been moved slightly. My jacket, which I'd thrown over a chair, was now hanging on the coat rack. Someone had been in my apartment. Not a burglar. Nothing was missing. But someone who had searched meticulously and then tried to put everything back exactly as they'd found it. They'd almost succeeded. I checked the bedroom next. The same subtle signs of intrusion were present. Drawers closed too neatly. The bed made too perfectly. My entire apartment had been searched by someone very professional and very thorough. The envelope with the remaining cash was still on the table, untouched. Whatever they'd been looking for, it wasn't money. I suddenly remembered the note Sarah had given me. I pulled it from my pocket and unfolded it with trembling fingers. Written in neat, precise handwriting was an address for Riverdale Psychiatric Hospital, followed by a name: Dr. Thomas Mercer, specialist in reality disorders. I stared at the note for a long time. A psychiatrist specializing in exactly what I was experiencing seemed too convenient, too perfect. But after what I'd just discovered, that someone had searched my apartment while I was out, I was running out of options. I needed answers, and Dr. Mercer might be my only chance to get them before the slippages Sarah described got worse, before I could no longer trust my own perception of reality. I put the note back in my pocket and began methodically checking the apartment for surveillance devices. I didn't find any, but that didn't mean they weren't there. The administrators, whoever or whatever they were, seemed capable of far more subtle methods of observation. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the building, every distant siren or car alarm sent me bolt upright in bed. Twice I thought I saw the administrator standing in the corner of my bedroom, only to blink and find nothing there. The slippages were getting worse. Tomorrow I would visit Dr. Thomas Mercer and hope he could provide the answers Sarah couldn't. The following morning, I stood at the bathroom sink, staring at my reflection. Dark circles had formed under my eyes from lack of sleep, and my skin looked pale. The bruise on my forehead had faded to a yellowish smudge, barely visible now. Physical evidence of my experience at Mindscope was disappearing, even as the mental effects intensified. I splashed cold water on my face and reached for a towel. When I looked up again, the mirror briefly showed the grimy, stained walls of that white room behind me. I spun around but saw only my bathroom wall, normal and unchanged. The slippage lasted less than a second, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. Sarah's warning repeated in my mind. The slippages will get worse. I needed answers before I completely lost my grip on reality. The note she'd given me felt heavy in my pocket as I pulled it out again, reading the address for Riverdale Psychiatric Hospital and the name Dr. Thomas Mercer. A psychiatrist seemed like an admission of defeat, an acknowledgement that what I'd experienced might be nothing more than a mental breakdown. But after finding evidence that someone had searched my apartment, I couldn't dismiss this as simple delusion. Something real was happening. Something beyond my understanding, and Dr. Mercer might be my only link to explanations. I caught the 10:15 bus to Riverdale Psychiatric Hospital, a sprawling red brick complex on the outskirts of town. It wasn't the sterile institutional building I'd imagined, but rather looked like a renovated historical site with manicured gardens and large windows. The main entrance faced a circular driveway lined with ornamental trees. At the reception desk, an older woman with gray hair looked up from her computer. "I have an appointment with Dr. Thomas Mercer," I lied, hoping a direct approach would work better than explaining my actual situation. She looked puzzled, tapping at her keyboard. "I don't see anything scheduled." "It might be under a referral from Sarah," I said, taking a chance. The receptionist's expression changed almost imperceptibly. "Oh, I see. Dr. Mercer does have an opening now. Second floor, East Wing, room 27B. He's expecting you." The ease with which I gained access made me uneasy. Either Sarah had somehow arranged this, or simply mentioning her name opened doors. Neither option seemed particularly reassuring. The hallways were quiet, with only occasional staff members passing by. Unlike the sterile white corridors of Mindscope, these were painted in soft blues and greens, with framed artwork hung at regular intervals. Despite the calming decor, my anxiety increased with each step. Room 27B had a frosted glass door with Dr. Thomas Mercer, specialist in cognitive perception, stenciled in black letters. I knocked once and heard a muffled, "Come in," from the other side. Dr. Mercer's office was nothing like the minimalist space where I'd met the administrator. Books covered nearly every available surface, stacked on shelves that reached the ceiling and piled on the floor in precarious towers. His desk was buried under papers, journals, and more books, many of them open to specific pages with sticky notes marking important sections. The man himself stood behind the desk, reviewing something in a thick binder. He was in his 50s, with gray-streaked hair and glasses. He wore a white doctor's coat over a button-up shirt and tie, looking like an academic physician. "Ah, you must be Marcus Reed," he said, closing the binder and extending his hand. "I've been expecting you." I hesitated before shaking his hand. "How did you know my name?" "I didn't give it to reception." He smiled, the expression not quite reaching his eyes. "Sarah contacted me after your meeting. Please sit down." I remained standing. "What exactly did she tell you?" "Everything, I imagine." He gestured to one of two chairs facing his desk. "About your experience with Mindscope, the White Room, the administrator, the reality slippages you've been experiencing since." Hearing him list these details so matter-of-factly was unsettling. I slowly sat in the offered chair, keeping my back straight, ready to move if necessary. "So, you believe me?" I asked cautiously. "Of course." Dr. Mercer took his own seat, leaning back casually. "You're not the first person to come to me with this exact experience, not even the 10th. That caught me off guard. There have been that many? More than you'd imagine." He removed his glasses, cleaning them with a cloth from his pocket. "I've been documenting these cases for nearly 3 years now." I studied him carefully. There was something almost rehearsed about his casualness, as if he'd had this conversation many times before. "Who are they? Mindscope, the administrator, all of it?" I asked. Dr. Mercer replaced his glasses and steepled his fingers. "They call themselves the Observers, though that's only one of many names they've used over the years. They're a research collective investigating the boundaries of human consciousness, particularly our perception of reality." "And the experiments?" "Not experiments in the traditional sense," he corrected. "Tests, more accurately. They're identifying individuals with specific neurological markers that make them sensitive to fluctuations in reality." That matched what Sarah had told me. "The flyer. It was targeted somehow?" "Precisely." Dr. Mercer nodded. "They don't distribute those randomly. Something about you drew their attention. The vague wording, the unusual compensation. It's all designed to appeal to people with particular cognitive traits." I thought about how I'd kept that flyer despite its suspicious nature, how I'd called the number despite my misgivings. "You said you worked with them," I prompted. "As a scientific consultant, yes." He sighed, removing his glasses again and rubbing the bridge of his nose. I was brought in to help analyze their data to provide context for what they were observing, but I didn't fully understand what they were doing to participants until later. And what exactly were they doing? Dr. Mercer leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly. Testing your ability to perceive multiple realities simultaneously. Despite having heard similar explanations from Sarah and hints from the forum posts, hearing it stated so definitively by a professional was jarring. Multiple realities, I repeated flatly. Current quantum theory suggests the existence of multiple dimensions, multiple versions of reality existing concurrently, he explained, gesturing to several books on quantum physics visible among the stacks. Most humans can only perceive one at a time, the reality their brain has evolved to process. But some individuals have the neurological architecture to potentially perceive more. And that's what Hour 1 tests for? This potential? Exactly. Dr. Mercer stood, moving to a bookshelf and pulling down a thick volume. Hour 1 isn't just testing your reactions, it's actively destabilizing the barriers in your mind that limit perception to a single reality. He flipped open the book to a marked page showing brain scans. These are from previous participants. The left shows normal baseline function. The right shows the same brain after completing Hour 1. Note the unusual activity in the temporal and parietal regions. I glanced at the scans but couldn't interpret the colorful patterns. So the hallucinations? The room changing? That was me seeing other realities? Overlapping realities, he corrected. What you experienced as deteriorating walls or inexplicable phenomena were glimpses of alternate versions of that space, bleeding through as your perceptual barriers weakened. A chill ran through me as I remembered the blood dripping from the ceiling, the walls that seemed to breathe. That can't be real. It's as real as this office, Dr. Mercer said, just not observable to most people. I thought of Sarah's eyes turning black. And what happens if these barriers keep weakening? Dr. Mercer's expression grew grave. Without stabilization, your perception will continue to fracture. The slippages will increase in frequency and duration. Eventually, you won't be able to distinguish between realities at all. Sarah mentioned that. I swallowed hard. She said the only option was to go back for Hour 2 or seek treatment, Dr. Mercer finished. Which is why she sent you to me. What kind of treatment? He returned to his desk and opened a drawer, removing a small metal case. I've developed a protocol that can reverse some of the perceptual changes induced by Hour 1. It's experimental, but I've had success with several patients. My suspicions spiked again. Why would you help people escape this process if you worked with them? Dr. Mercer's expression hardened slightly. Because I discovered their methods were permanently damaging participants. The observers don't care about the humans they test, only the results. Those who complete Hour 2 may gain stability, but they sacrifice something essential in the process. What do you mean? From what I've gathered, Hour 2 binds participants to the observers in some way. Their perception stabilizes, but at the cost of their autonomy. He set the metal case on the desk. I left when I realized this. Now I try to help those caught in their web. I stared at the case, wondering what it contained. Treatment or something else entirely? I still wasn't sure I could trust Dr. Mercer, despite his seemingly straightforward explanations. So those are my only options? Complete Hour 2 and become one of them, or try your experimental treatment. There is a third option, he said. Do nothing and eventually lose your grip on all realities. It's not a fate I'd recommend. Before I could respond, a sharp knock came at the door. A nurse in blue scrubs poked her head in. Dr. Mercer, there's an emergency with patient 17. They're requesting you immediately. He looked at his watch with concern. Tell them I'll be there in 2 minutes. The nurse nodded and disappeared. Dr. Mercer turned back to me. I'm sorry, but I need to handle this. It shouldn't take long. Please wait here. We have much more to discuss. He gestured to the bookshelves. Feel free to browse if you'd like. Some of those volumes might provide additional context for your situation. With that, he hurried out, closing the door behind him. Left alone in the cluttered office, I immediately stood and began examining the space more carefully. If Dr. Mercer had worked with the observers, there might be evidence of that connection somewhere. I moved to his desk first, careful not to disturb the papers too obviously. Most were academic articles about consciousness and perception, with titles like Quantum Observers and Conscious Collapse and Multiverse Theory in Neuroscience. Nothing immediately suspicious, but not exactly standard psychiatric literature either. On a side table behind the desk was a framed medical license for Thomas Mercer, MD, PhD. I picked it up, examining it closely. The issue date was only 2 years ago, which seemed recent for someone his age. The seal looked slightly off-center, and the paper quality didn't match other medical licenses I'd seen. I set it down and moved to a filing cabinet, slightly ajar. Inside were folders with patient names, organized alphabetically. I found the R section and quickly flipped through, but there was no file for Reed Marcus. I checked the S section next and found a thin folder labeled Sarah Winters. I hesitated, then pulled it out. The file contained only a single page, a transcript of a session from 3 months ago, around the time Sarah said she'd done hour 1. The most disturbing part was Dr. Mercer's assessment at the bottom. Subject continues to resist integration. Recommend increased monitoring and possible retrieval for hour 2 completion, with or without consent. Reality perception deteriorating rapidly, making her a liability. Her connection to potential candidates remains valuable, however. I felt terrified. This didn't sound like the writing of someone trying to help Sarah. It sounded like someone working with the observers, tracking her for them. I quickly replaced the file and continued searching. On a bookshelf behind his desk, I found a series of untitled black binders. I pulled one out and opened it to find photographs and dossiers of people I didn't recognize. Each had a status marking: completed, in process, or resistant. Footsteps in the hallway made me quickly replace the binder and return to my chair. The doorknob turned, and Dr. Mercer re-entered, looking slightly flustered. "Sorry about that interruption," he said, moving back to his desk. "Now, where were we?" I watched him carefully, my perception heightened by adrenaline and suspicion. As he sat down, the lighting in the room shifted slightly, and for just a moment, a heartbeat, his eyes changed. The irises flickered to solid black, just like Sarah's had done in the cafe, before returning to normal. I suddenly realized the truth. Dr. Mercer wasn't helping former test subjects. He was monitoring them, perhaps even retrieving them for the observers. I needed to leave immediately. "Actually, I just remembered an appointment," I said, standing up abruptly. "I should go." Dr. Mercer's expression barely changed, but I noticed his posture stiffen. "We haven't discussed your treatment options yet, Marcus. The slippages will only get worse without intervention." "I'll call to reschedule," I lied, already backing toward the door. He stood slowly. "I'm afraid I must insist you stay, for your own safety." His voice had changed subtly, taking on that same measured quality I'd heard from the administrator. The similarity was unmistakable now. "I need to leave," I said firmly, reaching behind me for the doorknob. "The observers have been waiting for you to come here," he said, his professional facade crumbling. "They knew you would seek help eventually. All the files I've shown you, the explanations, it was to gain your trust." My hand found the doorknob and I turned it, preparing to bolt. "Running won't help, Marcus," Dr. Mercer said, his eyes flickering to solid black again, staying that way longer this time. "You've already begun the process. Without completion, your mind will fracture beyond repair." I yanked the door open and stumbled into the hallway. A security guard stood there, hand moving toward his radio as he looked at me with concern. "Sir, is everything—" I didn't wait for him to finish. I pushed past him and ran toward the stairs, unwilling to risk the elevator. Behind me, I heard Dr. Mercer call out to the guard, "Stop him! Patient experiencing a psychotic episode." My footsteps sounded loudly in the stairwell as I took the steps 2 at a time, almost falling in my haste to reach the ground floor. When I burst through the exit door, I didn't stop to see if anyone was following. I ran across the hospital grounds toward the main road, not slowing until I reached a bus stop 2 blocks away. As I stood there, gasping for breath, my mind raced. Dr. Mercer had confirmed much of what Sarah told me, but he clearly wasn't the ally she thought he was. His black eyes marked him as someone already experiencing reality slippages, or perhaps someone who had completed Hour 2 and gained the ability to perceive multiple realities. Either way, I couldn't trust him. I couldn't trust Sarah either. Not completely. For all I knew, she might have sent me to him deliberately, knowing exactly what he was. The bus arrived and I climbed aboard, taking a seat near the back where I could watch for pursuers. As we pulled away from the hospital, a profound sense of isolation settled over me. I had no one to turn to, no one who could help me navigate this impossible situation. The slippages would continue to worsen. Dr. Mercer had confirmed that much, at least, and my options remained the same. Complete Hour 2 and potentially lose my autonomy to the observers. Try an unproven treatment from someone I couldn't trust, or do nothing and watch my grip on reality dissolve completely. As the bus carried me back toward my apartment, I wondered if I'd ever had any real choice at all, or if the observers had been guiding me down this path my entire life. The bus ride back from Riverdale Psychiatric Hospital felt endless. I kept checking over my shoulder, certain that Dr. Mercer or someone else from the hospital would be following me. My mind raced with everything I'd discovered. The patient file on Sarah, those black binders categorizing people as completed, in process, or resistant. And most disturbing of all, the way Dr. Mercer's eyes had flickered to solid black, just like Sarah's had done at the cafe. By the time I reached my stop, the sun was beginning to set. I walked quickly to my apartment building, taking a circuitous route and doubling back several times to ensure I wasn't being followed. I unlocked my apartment door cautiously, half expecting to find someone waiting inside. The space was empty, but something immediately caught my eye. A white envelope sat in the center of my kitchen table, identical to the one that had contained my payment from Mindscope. I hadn't left it there. I approached the table slowly, as if the envelope might somehow attack me. With trembling fingers, I picked it up. It was lightweight, containing something small. No name, no address, no markings of any kind. Just like the first envelope. I tore it open and tipped the contents onto the table. A single silver key and a small card with GPS coordinates written in the same elegant typeface as the note that had accompanied my payment. The coordinates were the same location in Oakwood Forest where the Mindscope building had appeared and disappeared. The key was modern, likely electronic, with no identifying marks or numbers. I sat heavily in a kitchen chair, staring at these items. How had they gotten into my locked apartment? The implications were terrifying. Either someone had a key to my place, or the observers possessed abilities beyond normal human constraints. I considered calling the police, but what would I tell them? That I was being stalked by entities who could see multiple realities. That a psychiatrist with occasionally black eyes was working with them. That mysterious envelopes kept appearing in my locked apartment. They'd think I was having a psychotic break. Maybe I was. I put the key in my pocket and went to the bathroom to splash cold water on my face. The face that stared back at me from the mirror looked haggard, with dark shadows under bloodshot eyes. I barely recognized myself. As I reached for a towel, the mirror's reflection changed. Instead of my bathroom wall, I saw the grimy, stained surface from the white room at Mindscope. The transformation lasted only a second before returning to normal, but it was long enough to send me stumbling backward in shock. "It's not real," I whispered. But even as the words left my mouth, I watched the bathroom walls flicker and transform. Clean white paint became mold-spotted and discolored, then snapped back to normal. I retreated to my living room, but the phenomenon followed. The walls pulsed and changed, moving between my apartment and the nightmare version from Hour 1. The transitions were happening more frequently now, lasting longer each time. I grabbed my laptop, desperate for distraction, but when I opened it, The screen displayed a countdown timer. 10, 9, 8. I slammed it shut and threw it aside, but the administrator's voice continued in my head, perfectly modulated and calm. 7, 6, 5. I pressed my hands against my ears, but it made no difference. The voice was coming from inside my mind. 4, 3, 2. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for whatever would happen at 0, but the countdown stopped abruptly, leaving me in tense silence. Night fell, and with it, my apartment transformed into a scene of changing horrors. Dark shapes moved across the floor independent of any light source. They formed human-shaped outlines that stood watching me from corners, disappearing when I tried to look directly at them. I tried to sleep, but each time I closed my eyes, the countdown would begin again, jolting me back to terrified wakefulness. By 3 in the morning, I sat huddled on my couch with all the lights on, watching as reality fractured around me. The key and coordinates card sat on the coffee table before me. A message, an invitation, or maybe a trap. By dawn, I knew I had no choice. The slippages were accelerating rapidly, just as Sarah and Dr. Mercer had warned. Soon I wouldn't be able to distinguish reality at all. Whatever waited for me at those coordinates couldn't be worse than this slow descent into madness. I showered and dressed mechanically, forcing myself to eat a piece of toast despite my churning stomach. As I moved around the apartment, the walls continued to change and transform, but I tried to ignore them, focusing on practical tasks instead. I grabbed my car keys and the silver key from the envelope, then hesitated. On impulse, I took the remaining cash from the Mindscope payment and shoved it in my pocket. Something told me I wouldn't be coming back to this apartment, regardless of what happened. The drive to Oakwood Forest was surreal. The road occasionally rippled beneath my tires like it was made of liquid rather than asphalt. Trees along the shoulder blurred and looked wrong, sometimes appearing charred and dead before returning to their normal green state. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, forcing myself to focus on the GPS directions. As I neared the coordinates, my heart sank. I expected to see only trees as I had during my previous visit. But there it was, the glass and steel building exactly as I remembered it, rising incongruously from the forest as if it had never disappeared. I parked in the same small clearing and sat in my car staring at the structure. Was it really there? Or was this another slippage? Only one way to find out. The building's entrance was locked, but the silver key from the envelope slid smoothly into the reader beside the door. A soft click, and the door swung open into a darkened lobby. The receptionist's desk stood empty, computer screens dark. The entire space felt abandoned. My footsteps bounced off the walls as I crossed the lobby toward the hallway where I'd first met the administrator. I didn't need directions. My feet seemed to know exactly where to go, as if I'd walked this path countless times before. The white room was at the end of the corridor, its door slightly ajar. I pushed it open slowly, expecting to find the administrator waiting, but the room was empty, or almost empty. The table was gone, replaced by a single chair facing a large monitor mounted on the wall. The chair sat in the center of the room as if waiting for me. I approached cautiously. The monitor flickered to life as I neared, displaying a familiar face. The administrator, perfect and immaculate as always. "Hello, Marcus," the recorded image said. "I'm pleased you've returned." I glanced around the empty room, confirming I was alone before sitting in the chair. "This is a recorded message, tailored to your specific circumstances," the administrator continued. "By now you are experiencing significant reality slippages. Moments when you perceive multiple realities simultaneously. This is not a malfunction or mental illness. It is the natural progression after hour 1. I leaned forward, hanging on every word as the administrator's image continued. "What you experienced during hour 1 was not an experiment in the traditional sense. It was an activation, a deliberate fracturing of the perceptual barriers that limit most humans to a single reality. This is a necessary first step in recruitment. Recruitment? I whispered. As if responding to my question, the administrator's image continued. The organization you know as Mindscope is merely one front for our true collective, which we call the Observers. We are individuals who have completed both hours of the process and developed the ability to perceive and navigate multiple realities simultaneously. The screen changed to show a simplified diagram of overlapping spheres, each labeled as a different reality layer. The universe, as most humans understand it, is merely one layer of an infinite multidimensional structure. Most minds cannot process this complexity and are locked into perceiving only one layer at a time. But certain individuals, like yourself, Marcus, possess the neurological architecture to perceive multiple layers simultaneously. We identify these individuals and offer them the choice to evolve beyond limited perception. The screen returned to the administrator. Hour 2 is not a continuation of testing, but a guided transformation. Those who complete it join our ranks with full awareness and control of their expanded perception. Those who refuse... He paused, his expression unchanging but somehow more severe. Eventually lose their grip on all realities as their minds attempt to process what they've experienced without proper training. A cold weight settled in my stomach as I recognized the truth in his words. The slippages were already overwhelming me. Without intervention, I would end up like Sarah, or worse. You believe you discovered this choice through your own investigation, the administrator continued. In reality, every step of your journey was anticipated and subtly guided. Dr. Thomas Mercer is one of our more recent recruits, assigned to monitor those who hesitate after hour 1 and direct them back to us when their symptoms become unmanageable. The monitor changed again, displaying something that shocked me. It was footage of me, as a child, no more than 7 years old, playing in a park. The camera zoomed in as I stopped suddenly and stared at something off-screen, something apparently invisible to the other children around me. More footage played. Me at 12, the day after my parents' funeral, waking up in the middle of the night and having a conversation with an empty chair. Me at 15, freezing during a math test and staring at the wall for nearly 2 minutes before continuing. Me at 22, walking through my college campus and abruptly changing direction for no apparent reason, avoiding the spot where, seconds later, a bicycle crashed. You have been observed throughout your life, Marcus, the administrator's voice explained over the footage. These moments were tests, subtle manipulations of reality around you to gauge your unconscious awareness. You've always sensed things others couldn't, perceived shifts others missed. This is why you were selected. The footage stopped, returning to the administrator's face. Even the financial difficulties that made our offer so appealing were orchestrated to ensure your participation. Your entire life has been guided toward this moment of choice. My mind reeled with the implications. Nothing had been accidental. Nothing had been truly mine. My whole existence had been some kind of elaborate setup for this recruitment. The choice remains yours, Marcus, the administrator said. Hour 2 awaits, should you choose to proceed. You will join us with full awareness and control of your expanded perception. Or we can remove all memories of this experience, allowing you to return to normal life, though you will forever remain unaware that your reality is being manipulated around you. The screen went dark, leaving me alone with the weight of this impossible decision. I sat motionless, trying to process everything I'd learned. My life had never been my own. I'd been watched, tested, manipulated, a lab rat in an experiment I never consented to. Anger flared, hot and sudden, but it quickly gave way to a deeper realization. I'd always felt it, that sense of being observed, those moments when reality seemed to hiccup around me. I dismissed them as imagination or coincidence, but they were real. I'd been perceiving multiple realities my entire life, just not consciously. The door behind me opened. I didn't need to turn to know who it was. I could feel the administrator's presence, as distinctive as a change in air pressure. "Have you reached a decision, Marcus?" he asked, his voice identical to the recording. I turned to face him. Did I ever really have a choice? Or was this always the only possible outcome? "Choice is the one thing we cannot manipulate," he replied, stepping into the room. "We can arrange circumstances, present options, even predict likely outcomes based on personality profiles. But the final decision must be genuinely yours. That is the foundation of our recruitment. And if I choose to forget, to go back to my normal life, we will remove all memories of Mindscope, the testing, and the subsequent events. Your reality slippages will cease. You will return to perceiving only one reality layer at a time." He paused. "But you will remain observable, and your potential will remain unrealized." I thought about my life before all this, struggling to pay rent, drifting between freelance jobs, feeling like something fundamental was missing. Had that emptiness been this unrealized potential? This awareness trying to break through? And if I choose Hour 2, what happens then? The administrator moved to stand beside the chair. "You will undergo a guided expansion of consciousness. Unlike the disorienting experience of Hour 1, this process will teach you to control your perception, to navigate between realities deliberately, rather than chaotically. You will join us as a trainee, learning to use your abilities under supervision." "To what end?" I asked. "What do the observers actually do with these abilities?" "We maintain balance," he replied. "Reality layers naturally influence each other. Without intervention, they would collapse into each other with catastrophic consequences. Some of us work to prevent this. Others pursue more self-interested applications of their abilities. So even among yourselves, there are factions, politics. We remain human, Marcus. Despite our expanded perception, power dynamics are inevitable." I looked around the white room, then back at the administrator. "Sarah said those who complete Hour 2 either become like you, or they can't handle what they see." What did she mean by that? "Not everyone adapts successfully to expanded perception. Those who cannot integrate the experience fully often suffer psychological fragmentation." His expression remained neutral. "Sarah's deterioration is unfortunate but not unexpected. Her neurological markers were borderline acceptable. And mine? Among the strongest we've observed in decades. Your likelihood of successful integration is very high." I stood up, needing to move, to think. The walls of the room flickered briefly, showing their decayed version before stabilizing. "The slippages are accelerating," the administrator noted. "Your decision cannot be delayed much longer." He was right. Even now, shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move independently, forming shapes that disappeared when I tried to focus on them. Reality was breaking down around me. I thought about my options. Forgetting everything would be easier. I could return to normal life, blissfully unaware of multiple realities or the entities manipulating them. But I would be surrendering the truth for comfort, accepting a managed existence over an authentic one. Hour 2 meant venturing into unknown territory, transforming my consciousness permanently. It meant joining an organization with unclear motives and internal conflicts. But it also meant understanding, truly understanding, the nature of reality in ways few humans ever could. I realized I'd always been searching for something beyond the visible world. That sense of something more had driven my curiosity and my willingness to take risks. Accepting the Mindscope experiment was even part of that search. I took a deep breath and faced the administrator. My decision was made. "I want to know the truth," I said finally. "I want to see reality as it actually is, not how it's presented to me. I'll do Hour 2. The administrator nodded once, as if he'd anticipated this choice all along. "Very good, Marcus. We will begin immediately." He gestured toward the door, indicating I should follow him. As I walked out of the white room, I wondered if I would ever see the world the same way again. Whatever waited for me beyond that door would transform me permanently, for better or worse. But it would be my choice, perhaps the first truly informed choice I'd ever made. And somehow, that made all the difference. "You made the right choice, Marcus," the administrator said without turning around. "Few candidates possess your level of potential." I didn't respond. What was there to say? That I was terrified? That I felt manipulated despite his assurances that my choice was genuine? That even now, as I walked these sterile corridors, the walls occasionally moved and changed before my eyes? We passed through sections of the building I hadn't seen during my first visit. The modern architecture gave way to older construction, exposed stone and weathered wood that seemed incredibly old compared to the sleek exterior. The deeper we went, the more I felt a strange pressure building in my skull. "The facility exists across multiple reality layers," the administrator explained, noticing my confusion. "What appears as a modern research center in your primary reality shows up differently in others. You're beginning to perceive these overlaps." I watched as my hand passed through a patch of air that seemed to move. "Is this part of Hour 2 already?" "No. This is merely the continuation of your natural progression after Hour 1. The barriers in your mind are deteriorating rapidly." We stopped before a circular door made of some dark metal I couldn't recognize. It had no visible handle or keypad, yet it swung open at our approach, revealing a perfectly circular chamber beyond. 5 figures stood in a loose circle within the room, each identical to the administrator who had guided me here. The same immaculate black suits, the same unnaturally perfect posture, the same emotionless expressions. They turned in unison as we entered, their movements synchronized with mechanical precision. "The candidate has consented," my administrator announced. One of the others stepped forward. "You understand that this process is irreversible, Marcus Reed? Your perception will be permanently altered." "I understand," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "Very well. Please stand in the center." As I moved to the middle of the room, I noticed that the floor beneath my feet was engraved with intricate patterns, circles within circles, marked with symbols I didn't recognize. The walls were lined with mirrors, but they didn't reflect the room correctly. Each showed slightly different versions of the chamber, with subtle variations in lighting, furnishings, even the positions of the administrators. "Hour 1 fractured your perception," my administrator explained, joining the others to complete their circle around me. "Hour 2 will expand it in a controlled manner. Unlike your previous experience, you will be guided through the process." "Will it hurt?" I asked, remembering the mental agony of Hour 1. "Physical pain is irrelevant to the process. Your consciousness will temporarily separate from bodily sensation." That wasn't exactly reassuring. The administrators raised their hands in unison, palms facing inward toward me. The air in the room felt thick, with pressure building against my skin. "Close your eyes, Marcus," one said. "Focus on the sound of my voice." I did as instructed, shutting my eyes against the increasingly strange distortions in the mirrors. "Your consciousness is not limited to your physical body," the voice continued, perfectly modulated and seemingly coming from everywhere at once. "It connects with all possible versions of reality. Most humans cannot perceive this connection. You are about to join those who can." A buzzing sound filled the room, starting so low I felt rather than heard it, gradually rising in pitch until it vibrated through my bones. The pressure against my skin increased until I struggled to breathe. "Do not resist," the voice instructed. "Resistance creates friction between realities. Allow your consciousness to expand naturally." I tried to relax, to surrender to whatever was happening, but instinct fought against it. My body wanted to flee, to escape this overwhelming pressure. "Focus on my countdown, Marcus. 10. The administrator's voice anchored me as the buzzing intensified. 9. The pressure reached a point where I thought my skull might crack. 8. My breathing became shallow, and rapid. 7. The floor seemed to fall away beneath my feet. 6. I felt myself floating, untethered. 5. The boundaries of my body began to blur. 4. I existed everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. 3. Awareness expanded outward like ripples in a pond. 2. Reality fractured into infinite variations. 1. And then everything changed. I was still standing in the circular chamber, eyes closed, the administrators around me. But I was also somewhere else, everywhere else. My awareness spread beyond my body, extending outward and perceiving multiple versions of reality simultaneously. I saw the chamber as it existed across different dimensions. In one, an ancient stone circle open to the sky. In another, a high-tech facility filled with equipment I couldn't comprehend. In yet another, a void with the 6 administrators floating in emptiness. But it went beyond the immediate space. I perceived the entire building in its multiple manifestations, the forest outside, the city beyond, all existing in countless variations, overlapping in layers. "Open your eyes, Marcus," the administrator instructed. I opened them to a world transformed. The administrators still stood in their circle, but now I saw them as they truly were. Their human appearance merely the most accessible version of entities that existed across multiple realities simultaneously. They changed between shapes, sometimes appearing as the suited figures I recognized, sometimes as shimmering columns of light, sometimes as patterns too complex for my mind to fully comprehend. "This is overwhelming," I gasped, my voice sounding strange in my ears. "It will become manageable with training," one of them said. "Focus on maintaining your primary perceptual anchor, the reality you've always known. Use it as a reference point." I tried to concentrate on the physical chamber as I'd first seen it, using it to anchor myself amid the flood of overlapping perceptions. Gradually, the chaos began to organize itself in my mind. The multiple versions of reality still existed, but they arranged themselves in layers. I could focus on one while maintaining awareness of the others. "You're adapting quickly," an administrator noted. "Most candidates require more time to achieve perceptual stability." As my perception steadied, I began to notice something remarkable. Thin filaments of energy connecting the various reality layers, places where the barriers between dimensions were naturally thin. More surprising were the deliberate manipulations, points where the administrators or others like them had carefully pushed one reality to influence another. "You're seeing the connections between realities," my original administrator said, stepping forward. "The natural bridges and the constructed ones." "You create these connections?" I asked, watching a filament of energy pulsate between layers. "We maintain some, remove others, create new ones when necessary. This is our primary function, maintaining balance between realities that constantly threaten to collapse into each other." For what felt like hours, though time seemed strangely irrelevant in this state, the administrators guided me through exercises to control my expanded perception. They taught me to focus on specific reality layers, to trace the connections between them, to recognize the signs of dangerous instability. Gradually, I began to understand why Hour 1 had been so horrifying. The blood dripping from walls, the shadows moving independently, the monstrous transformations. These weren't hallucinations, but glimpses of other realities seeping into mine as my perception fractured. The terror had been necessary to shock my mind out of its lifelong belief in a single, fixed reality. "The process is complete," the administrator finally announced. "Your perceptual expansion has been successfully integrated." The circle broke apart, and the intense pressure in the room dissipated. I felt myself settle back into my body, though my expanded awareness remained. I was still Marcus Reed, but fundamentally changed, a human being who could perceive the multi-layered nature of existence. "How do you feel?" the administrator asked. "Different," I replied, struggling to find the right words. more complete somehow. Like I've been looking through a keyhole my entire life, and someone finally opened the door. He nodded, as if this was the answer he expected. You will continue to process these changes for some time. The initial disorientation will fade as you learn to control your focus. What happens now? I asked. Now you begin your training as an observer. The administrator led me from the chamber, back through corridors that I now perceived in multiple manifestations simultaneously. It was disorienting to walk on floors that appeared solid in my primary reality, but existed as water, light, or nothing at all in others. We entered what appeared to be a conference room, or at least that was its manifestation in my primary reality. Around a long table sat several people who, like the administrators, changed between human appearances and more complex shapes. Unlike the administrators, however, these individuals displayed more variation, more personality in their appearances. These are senior observers, the administrator explained. Not all of us maintain the uniformity that you've seen thus far. That is a choice made by those of us in administrative roles. A man who appeared to be in his 40s stood and approached us. Unlike the others, his movements seemed more naturally human, though still with that slight, uncanny precision I'd noticed in the administrators. This is Daniel, my administrator said. He will be your mentor during your training period. Daniel extended his hand, a surprisingly normal gesture amidst all the strangeness. Welcome, Marcus. The transition is disorienting, I know. I shook his hand, grateful for the human contact. That's an understatement. I specialize in guiding new observers through their adaptation period, Daniel explained. You'll work with me daily until you've mastered the basics of controlled perception and cross-reality observation. How long does that usually take? It varies. Weeks, sometimes months. You're showing remarkable adaptation already, which is promising. As the initial shock of my transformation began to fade, questions multiplied in my mind. What exactly do observers do? The administrator mentioned maintaining balance between realities, but what does that mean in practice? Daniel gestured for me to take a seat at the table. Our primary purpose is to monitor the boundaries between reality layers and prevent catastrophic collapses. When multiple realities occupy the same relative dimensional space, they naturally influence each other. Without intervention, they would eventually merge, with disastrous consequences. So you're like reality maintenance workers? A subtle smile crossed Daniel's face. That's one way to put it. We observe points of instability and reinforce the boundaries when necessary. But there's more to it than that, I guessed, remembering what the administrator had said about internal politics. Daniel's expression grew more serious. As with any organization, different individuals have different priorities. Some observers are purely focused on maintaining stability. Others explore the possibilities of influencing specific realities for various purposes. Manipulation, I said. Yes. The ability to perceive multiple realities grants power. How that power is used varies greatly among our members. The administrator, who had remained silent during this exchange, spoke up. You will be assigned a specific territory to monitor alongside Daniel. Your training will be practical as well as theoretical. A territory? A designated section of overlapping realities, Daniel explained. Think of it as a geographic area that exists across all reality layers. You'll learn to monitor the boundaries within that space, identify potential instabilities, and eventually perform necessary adjustments. It was overwhelming to consider, but something in me responded to the structured approach. After days of chaotic perceptual slippages, the promise of training and control was appealing. When do we start? I asked. Tomorrow, Daniel said. For now, you should return to your apartment and rest. The initial perceptual expansion is mentally exhausting, even if you don't feel it immediately. I can go back to my normal life, just like that? The administrator's expression remained neutral. Your life will never be normal again, Marcus. But yes, You may return to your residence. Your training schedule will accommodate your existing routines for now." Daniel added, "It's actually beneficial for new observers to maintain contact with their original reality layer. It helps anchor your perception during the adaptation period." The administrator handed me a small metallic device that resembled a business card. "This will allow you to contact Daniel or the facility when necessary. It works across all reality layers." I took it, feeling the weight of my new identity settling onto my shoulders. I had become something more than human, or perhaps simply more aware of what being human truly meant. After final instructions from Daniel about our meeting point for the next day, I was escorted back through the facility to the entrance. The forest outside looked exactly as it had when I arrived, yet completely different. I could now see the thin places where other realities bled through, the subtle distortions that had always existed, but that my limited perception had filtered out. I drove back to Riverdale in a state of contemplative silence. The world around me was both known and utterly transformed. Cars passed on the highway, people walked on sidewalks, buildings stood solid against the sky. All ordinary scenes that now revealed their multi-layered nature. Behind everything I had always accepted as singular reality, I now perceived variations and alternatives, existing simultaneously in the same space. My apartment building looked the same as ever from the outside, but as I approached, I saw how it existed across multiple realities. In some, fallen to ruin. In others, never built at all. In yet others, transformed into structures I couldn't comprehend. The version I had always known, the one in my primary reality layer, remained most solid to my perception, but the alternatives showed at the edges of my awareness. Inside my apartment, everything appeared normal, to ordinary perception. But I was no longer limited to ordinary perception. The walls occasionally revealed their alternates from other realities. Shadow figures, beings that existed primarily in adjacent reality layers, moved through spaces I had always thought empty. I understood now why Hour 1 had been so terrifying. I had caught glimpses of these phenomena without context or control. I sat on my couch, watching reality change and flow around me. It was both beautiful and unsettling. Everything I had ever known was simultaneously more complex and more connected than I had imagined. My phone rang, pulling me from my thoughts. The caller ID showed unknown, but somehow I knew who it was. "Hello, Daniel," I answered. "Good. Your perception is already sharpening," he replied. "How are you adjusting?" "It's a lot to process." "That's to be expected. Try to get some rest. Focus on your primary reality layer when the overlaps become too disorienting. I'll meet you tomorrow at 9 at the cafe 3 blocks from your apartment." "Not at the facility?" "We'll be working in the field. Your assigned territory includes parts of Riverdale. Better to start directly." After he hung up, I walked through my apartment, testing my new perception. I found I could control the intensity of the overlap somewhat by concentrating. When I focused on my primary reality layer, the alternatives receded to the periphery of my awareness. When I relaxed that focus, the multiple versions became equally present. That night, I lay in bed watching shadows move across my ceiling. Not the ordinary shadows cast by streetlights, but entities that existed primarily in adjacent realities, their presence barely registering in mine. I should have been terrified, but instead felt a strange calm. These phenomena had always been there. I just hadn't been able to see them. Sleep came surprisingly easily, deep and dreamless. Perhaps because, for the first time in days, I wasn't fighting to make sense of my fragmented perception. The expansion was complete. The integration begun. I woke at dawn, feeling more rested than I had since Hour 1. My expanded perception remained, but the initial disorientation had faded considerably. I could move through my apartment, preparing for the day, while maintaining awareness of the reality overlaps without becoming distracted by them. As I dressed, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror. I looked the same, exactly the same, and yet somehow fundamentally changed. It wasn't anything visible. It was something in my eyes, a depth of awareness that hadn't been there before. Still me, I told my reflection. Just more. At precisely 9 o'clock, I entered the cafe where Daniel waited. He sat at a corner table, dressed in business casual rather than the formal suits favored by the administrators. Like them, he maintained perfect posture, but his movements seemed more naturally human, deliberate rather than mechanical. "Good morning, Marcus," he said as I approached. "How was your first night with expanded perception?" Better than I expected. I sat across from him. I thought I'd be up all night seeing things move in the dark. He smiled slightly. "The human mind is remarkably adaptable, yours especially so. The initial reports from your hour one were impressive." "Reports?" I raised an eyebrow. "You've been watching me since then?" "Of course. All candidates are observed between hours." I thought about the days after hour one, my desperate research, meeting Sarah, visiting Dr. Mercer. "So you know about your investigation?" "Yes. Including your meeting with Sarah Winters and your visit to Dr. Mercer." Daniel sipped his coffee. "Your resourcefulness was noted. So was your determination to understand what was happening to you. Those qualities are valuable in an observer." "And Sarah, is she being helped at all?" Daniel's expression grew serious. "Sarah Winters represents a complicated case. Her neurological markers were borderline acceptable for hour one. She was never intended to proceed to hour two." "So you just... what? Let her suffer through reality slippages that get progressively worse?" "Intervention has been attempted. She's rejected it thus far." He paused. "Not everyone who experiences hour one can adapt successfully, Marcus. Some refuse the help we offer." "And Dr. Mercer? What's his role in all this?" "Dr. Mercer completed both hours approximately 2 years ago. He serves as a monitoring agent for candidates who attempt to seek external help after hour one. He reports directly to the administrators." I recalled the file I'd found in Mercer's office, his assessment of Sarah. "He's not trying to help people like Sarah at all, is he? His primary function is observation, not intervention." Daniel's tone remained neutral. "You'll come to understand that the relationship between observers and candidates is more complex than it might initially appear." I leaned back in my chair, studying him. "So, what's my first lesson?" "Perception control in dynamic environments." He gestured around the cafe. "Tell me what you see, not in your primary reality layer, but in the alternatives." I looked around, allowing my focus to shift from my primary reality. The cafe transformed in my perception. In one reality layer, it was abandoned, dust covering tables and chairs. In another, it was a completely different business. A bookstore with shelves where counters should be. In yet another, the space didn't exist at all, replaced by an empty lot visible through a kind of perceptual translucence. "It's different in every reality," I said. "Abandoned in one, a bookstore in another, not even here in a third." Daniel nodded approvingly. "Good. You're perceiving clearly without losing your anchor to your primary reality. Now look at the people." I shifted my focus to the handful of customers scattered around the cafe. Unlike the environment, which maintained a relatively stable form in each reality layer, the people were more complex. Some existed in multiple realities simultaneously, slightly different versions of themselves overlapping like double-exposed photographs. Others appeared in only one reality, absent entirely from others. Some exist across multiple realities, others don't, I observed. The ones who exist in multiple realities look almost the same but with small differences. "Those are versions of the same individual across reality layers," Daniel explained. "The more realities a person exists in simultaneously, the stronger their impact on the multiverse structure. And those who only exist in one? Reality-specific manifestations. Their existence doesn't extend beyond a single layer. He pointed subtly toward a barista behind the counter. Now, observe her carefully. Tell me what you see. I focused on the young woman making coffee. At first, she appeared normal, existing primarily in my reality layer with shadowy versions in a few adjacent ones. But as I watched more closely, I noticed something unusual. Thin filaments of energy connecting her to specific points in the cafe, almost like invisible threads anchoring her to the space. She has connections, I said, struggling to find the right words, like tethers to specific points in this reality. Daniel smiled. Very good. You're seeing a stabilization node, a person whose presence helps maintain reality consistency in this location. Some humans naturally serve this function without knowing it. Their routine presence reinforces reality boundaries. For the next 2 hours, Daniel guided me through increasingly complex perceptual exercises. He taught me to identify different types of connections between realities, to recognize potential points of instability, and to track the movement of entities that existed primarily between reality layers rather than within them. By the time we finished, my head was buzzing with new information, but I felt more in control of my expanded perception than I had since the process began. You're progressing faster than expected, Daniel said as we left the cafe. Tomorrow we'll begin work on your assigned territory, the eastern section of Riverdale, including your apartment building. My building is in my territory? Yes, that's intentional. New observers typically monitor the areas they're already familiar with. Your existing knowledge of the primary reality layer provides a solid foundation. As we walked down the street, I noticed how differently I now perceived the world around me. The multiple reality layers no longer felt chaotic or overwhelming. They had structure, patterns I was beginning to recognize. Daniel, I said, stopping at a corner, what made you decide to become an observer? He considered the question carefully. I didn't see it as a decision so much as an acceptance of what I already was. Like you, I had always sensed things others couldn't. The opportunity to understand those perceptions, to give them context and purpose, that was what appealed to me. And do you have any regrets? He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Knowledge always comes at a cost, Marcus. The question is whether the price is worth what you gain. He paused. For me, it was. I believe it will be for you as well. We parted ways at the intersection with instructions to meet again the following morning. I continued toward my apartment, my mind filled with everything I'd learned and everything I still needed to understand. The world around me was transformed, not physically, but in my perception of it. I now saw the reality I had always known as just one layer among many, all existing simultaneously in the same space. The buildings, streets, and people I passed were both exactly what they had always been and infinitely more complex than I had ever imagined. I had begun a journey into understanding the true nature of reality, a journey that had only just started. The uncertainty of what lay ahead was balanced by the wonder of what I could already perceive and the promise of greater understanding to come. As I reached my apartment building, I paused to look back at the city stretching out before me. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that I had made the right choice. Whatever challenges awaited me as an observer, whatever politics and complexities existed within their ranks, I could never have returned to the limited perception I'd known before.